Alright, welcome back. In this video, we're going to work on the styling of our site. Right now, it's definitely nowhere near what it's supposed to look like at the end. So let's actually compare them side by side. Here's ours over here. So some of the big changes we need to make, rounding the corners, adding some spacing here up top, changing the styling of the buttons here. So these buttons don't really look like buttons until you hover over them, and we get a hover effect. Our buttons are definitely hideous, and we don't have any hover effect on them. Also, the position of them is a little bit wrong. As you can see, if I guess here, I get text, but if I refresh, that text space is already taken up. Versus on our version, if I guess, the text pushes everything away to the sides. Also, there's an animation here. So when I click, notice how they fade out slowly. On ours, when we click, well, if I click an incorrect one, it just immediately is removed. So we want to add a transition to that. Also, we have the H1 up here that needs some work on ours. It needs to take up more space. We need to change the background color. We want to change the font. We need to make sure that the span of our color is formatted correctly, so it's on its own line and it's a larger font. Also, we need to change the font for the entire body, so these are all the same font. And lastly, you'll notice we have a little bit of space right here between the stripe and the end of the body. And in the solution version, there is no space at all. Okay, let's get started by first tackling this H1. So I'm going to go to my Sublime Text and go to the H1. And the first thing that we'll do is just align things in the middle. As you can see in the solution, things are aligned center. So all we need to do is add text align center and save and refresh. Okay, slight improvement. Next up, let's change the background color. So the color is going to be steel blue, but you'll notice that if I refresh the page right now, it works just fine. But if I refresh again and then I win the game or I click on new colors, it goes back to black. And that's because our JavaScript code is overriding that. We're setting it back to this dark gray, blackish color. In our JavaScript, we need to find the places where we're resetting it to this color, which is 232323. Here we go. We just want to change this to be steel blue. And that's all. So when I refresh, it starts as steel blue. If I get new colors, it stays as steel blue. Okay, so that's that. Now let's get rid of all the black space on either side of our H1. So in our H1, we're going to get rid of all margin 0, on top and bottom, left and right. So notice what happens when I do that. That black space goes away on all sides, except for this little bit of spacing on the left, top, and right. And that's not coming from our H1, that's actually coming from the body. So to fix that, we can go to the body and give it margin 0. And now pay attention to this little gap. I'll refresh, and that goes away. So our white stripe goes all the way to the side, just like it does in this version here. Okay, next up, let's focus on the font. So the font is going to be the same for all of our elements, the buttons and the H1 and the span here. It's all the same font, slightly different font weights. And we're going to use just one of the built-in fonts, the system fonts, which is called Avenir. So that's going to be font family Avenir. That is a font that may not work on every system out there. So we're going to add in another option, which is Montserrat, just like that. So we end up with this font here, which obviously doesn't look exactly the same. And that comes down to our font weight. So we need to change the weight of this font. Because it's an H1, the default is to make it bolded or to have like a 700 or 800 or even 900 font weight. What we want to do is give it font weight normal. So in our H1, I'm going to add font weight normal and save. We refresh. That's looking closer now. There's a few other things we need to change. The first of which is that this is all uppercase. And we can do that with our CSS using text transform, uppercase, and save. So now things look closer. And we'll also want to make sure that our color is on its own line and that we style that span slightly differently. To do that, we're going to go over here into our HTML, and actually we're going to edit the HTML a little bit. And this is the first way that we're going to make this work. We'll see another way of doing it with pure CSS, but we're going to start by styling this, where we have the great on one line, and then to add a break, we can use a BR tag. And actually, this is not a great idea as far as style. It's a little bit frowned upon, but it's a quick and easy way to get started, adding some returns and some line breaks in. That's all that this tag does, is it adds a line break. So we want one after the great, we want a break, and then our span, and then we want another break, and then color game at the bottom. And if we refresh now, you can see we're getting closer. Now we need to focus on making this span a lot larger. So this span has an ID of color display. So we're going to go over to our CSS and select color display, just like this, the ID color display, and then we're going to say font size is 200% of the H1 font size. And if we refresh, we now get this much larger font size, and we're getting closer. We have our breaks in here. You'll also notice though that we have a lot more space between the lines than we do over here. So there's a few things that we can do to work on that. The first one is change the line height. So we'll give it a line height of 1.1 and save. And let's look at our version again and refresh. And you can see that shrinks down a bit, but now we lost the space on the top and the bottom. We need a little bit of space there. So what we'll do is go in and add some padding. So we're going to add padding to the top and bottom only, not the left and right. And we want 20 pixels on the top and bottom. So we can do that just like this, padding, 20 pixels, and 0. We could also have done padding top, 20 pixels, and padding bottom, but this is a nicer short way of doing it. Refresh, and you can see we're almost there now. So our header looks fine. We have the correct font, the correct font weights, it's all in uppercase, the correct background color. Let's make sure as I play, it stays correct. It looks all good. The next thing we should tackle are the buttons on this nav bar. So we definitely have a long way to go to improve those. The first thing we want to do is get rid of the borders, so we don't have this obvious border around the button. We also will want to get rid of the background color. So there should be no background, as you can see here. It's just white until we hover or until we select one. Also, we want to make sure the font family is the same as this font up here. So let's get started. And I'm going to select all buttons. So button, and we're just going to say border none, and save. Pay attention to the buttons when I refresh. Okay, so we now have no border, but we still have that background color. So now let's say background none, and save and refresh, and we're getting closer. So now we have just plain text, and we'll start by making all that text uppercase like we have over here. So we use text transform again. Just copy that line over, paste that in there, and refresh. Now our buttons are all in uppercase. The next thing we want to do is make sure that the button goes all the way from the top to the bottom of the div stripe container. Right now, it only takes up a part of the space. So we can do that by setting height to be 100%, and that means it will take up 100% of the containing element. As you can see, that gets us a lot closer. We just now need to change some colors, change the font size, the font weight, and then change the hover effect, which we don't have set up yet. The next thing that we'll do is make the font weight a little bit heavier and change the color to be steel blue as well. So font weight, we'll do 700, and then color will also be steel blue. And let's check that out. Refresh. So it gets a little bit bolder. And you can also see that the color has now changed to that steel blue, the same color we have back here. There's a really minor change that we can make, which is to change the letter spacing to be 1 pixel. And if you pay attention when I refresh, you can see things space out just a little bit between each letter. Lastly, let's focus on the font size. They seem a little bit too small. So we're going to just use font size and set it to be inherit. And if I refresh, you can see that they inherit the font size and we don't have to explicitly set it. So let's take a look now. One of the big differences is that they're currently spaced differently. As soon as the page is loaded, we have this space here. On our version, however, we don't have that space until we click on a button. So what we need to do is actually style the span that's right here, and that span is called message, and we're going to want to go and give that some properties to make it take up that space. And all we need to do is change one property actually. So we're going to select display or message, which is the span, and we're going to change the display property to be inline block. So what that will do, if I refresh, so you won't notice a big difference right away, but that's because we also need to assign it a width. If we now give it a width of 20% and save and refresh, we now have this span, even though it doesn't have anything in it, that takes up 20% of this screen. So that pushes these elements to the side, which is exactly what we want. Let's take a look and compare them. All right, so that looks pretty close now. What we'll work on next is getting the selected class to match the right color and having our hover effect as well. So that's going to be down in our button, and we're going to add the hover effect first. So all we need to do is add in button :hover, and we're going to change the font color to be white and the background color to be steel blue. So we're basically reversing the colors, and we'll save and refresh. Now as I hover, you can see I get that effect. Perfect. And our selected class that we have is going to look just the same. I'm just going to copy these styles. There is no difference when we're hovering over something versus when it's selected. They should look the same. So you can see that looks right. And I hover, and only while I hover does it get that blue background and white text color. And when I move, it goes away. There is a slight difference. If I hover over the solution buttons, notice that it fades in that color. It's not just an instant switch. On my version, it just toggles instantly. We can fix that using a CSS transition property. Inside the button selector, we're going to write transition and pass it two arguments or two values. And the first one is what we want to transition. And in our case, we're just going to add it to every property. And then the next one is how long we want it to take. So I'm going to exaggerate it at first with 2 seconds. So again, the transition property is how we can tell CSS how to animate transitions between color changes or font size changes, any properties. So what I said here is that anytime a property changes on any button, which in our case will really just be color and background. So whenever the color changes and the background color changes, it should take 2 seconds. And you'll see when I refresh and I hover, oh, it's still not working. I'm missing my S here, 2.0 S. And now if I refresh and hover, it takes 2 seconds to fade in. And when I click to add the selected class, it also takes 2 seconds, and it takes 2 seconds to fade out when I leave. So 2 seconds is definitely too long. I think I'm aiming for about 0.3 seconds. Let's test that out. There we go. That looks pretty good to me. The last big thing is getting the rounded corners on these squares. The way that we get those rounded corners is using a property called border radius. So I have the MDN docs open. If you want to take a look, it's a good read, but they show you some examples on the different things you can do with border radius. So what we're going to do is give it a slight border radius, and these are squares here. And let's take a look at what we're aiming for. So those are what we want to get. So a slight curve. Let's go up to our square class and assign a border radius. And let's do something really exaggerated to start. I'll show you what happens if we do 50%. We get circles. And you might actually prefer to use circles. I was considering using them, but in the end I preferred these rounded corner squares. And the number that I used is 15%. And we'll just double check and compare those. Okay, so that looks good, 15%. But if you wanted, I'll show you what happens if we did something like 5% and refresh. We get very slightly rounded corners. So I'll go back to my 15, refresh, and now we have our nice rounded corners. But we also need to work on getting the animation effect, because when I click on one of these, notice how when the color changes, it fades out, just like the hover effect faded in and out. To achieve that, we also need to use the transition property, but in a slightly different way. So I'm going to go to square, and the only thing that we want to transition is the background color, or just background. And again, let's do a long time, like 2.0 seconds, and see how that looks. So I'll refresh, and I'll click on one of these. You can see it takes 2 whole seconds to fade out. So we don't want something to last that long. Probably go for 0.6 maybe. Let's try that. Okay, that seems reasonable. So you can see whenever that background changes, it takes 0.6 seconds. What's different though, is that when other properties change, it doesn't animate. Unlike our buttons, where we said when any property changes, it should take 0.3 seconds, we're only targeting the background, and when that changes, it should take 0.6 seconds. One minor thing that we do want to be aware of is that the transition property won't work in all browsers the way that we have it written right now. To be as browser friendly as possible, we actually need to add in 2 more properties, which we won't notice any difference in functionality, but they are just for browser support. So the first one is WebKit-transition, and we'll just add the same exact value here, just like that. And then we need another one, which is, this should be 1 dash, Moz, M-O-Z. So these are actually browser prefixes. So WebKit is for WebKit, which is an engine that browsers use, like Safari. And then we have Moz, M-O-Z, which is short for Mozilla, which is what Firefox is built on. So these are just to add some more support because the transition property isn't built into every single browser yet. So we refresh, nothing should seem different. Our game still works the same way and we still get the same animation. And we should do the same thing down here when we have transition all. Just duplicate this and change that to be transition all, and transition all 0.3 seconds for the MOZ transition. One last thing that we can fix here is the bit of spacing in between the stripe and the start of our grid. So you can see we have some more spacing here that we don't have here. And right now, if we inspect, we have an element that is around our grid. We have our squares, and we have a div ID container. And that container div goes around all 6 squares. So we can use that and just add some spacing to that container div. We'll just add a margin to the top and bottom. So I think we've styled it already a little bit. Here we go. So we said margin is 0 and auto. What we'll do instead is say margin is 20 pixels on the top and bottom and auto on the left and right, which is how it is centered. So we want that to be auto on left and right, but 20 pixels on top. Refresh, we have our spacing. Okay, so we're done with the styling for now.